There is a man in the Bible who appears without an origin, no past, no genealogy, and no recorded death. A mysterious king who appears before Abraham, blesses the patriarch, and vanishes from history as if he never truly belonged to the ordinary world of men. His name was Melchizedek, and to this day, scholars, theologians, and historians continue asking the same question: who really was this man? Because the deeper ancient texts are analyzed, the more impossible Melchizedek seems to become. Today you will discover the story of the most enigmatic figure in the scriptures, the eternal priest mentioned even before the law of Moses, and why many believe Melchizedek was far more than merely an ancient king. The deserts of the ancient Middle East hold stories forgotten by time. Civilizations rose and vanished beneath those skies. Kingdoms emerged, wars were fought, and in the middle of that ancient world, a mysterious figure silently entered biblical history. The first time the name Melchizedek appears is in the book of Genesis. Abraham had just returned from war. After confronting powerful kings to rescue Lot, his nephew, Abraham came back carrying the marks of battle. The atmosphere was tense. The ancient world was brutal. Kingdoms constantly fought for territory, wealth, and survival. But then something unexpected happens. A man appears, without announcement, without introduction, without explanation. Melchizedek, the king of Salem, priest of God Most High. At first glance, the moment seems small, but it would become one of the greatest mysteries in the entire Bible, because Melchizedek appears before Abraham as someone completely different from every other figure in Scripture. No lineage is given, no father is mentioned, no mother is mentioned, no origin, no descendants, no birth record, and even stranger, no recorded death. In a Bible where genealogies were extremely important, that is almost impossible to ignore. Virtually every major biblical figure has a family background described, but not Melchizedek. He simply appears, as if he already existed before everything, and then disappears again, as if he were not bound by ordinary human time. But there is something even more intriguing. Abraham, one of the most important figures in biblical history, shows deep reverence toward him. Melchizedek offers bread and wine. He blesses Abraham, and then Abraham does something highly unusual. He gives Melchizedek a tenth of everything. In the ancient world, this represented recognition of superior spiritual authority. And this is exactly where the mystery begins to grow. Because who could possibly hold spiritual authority above Abraham? Why does such an important figure appear so suddenly, only to almost completely vanish from the narrative afterward? For centuries, scholars have tried to understand who Melchizedek truly was. The most traditional interpretation claims he was simply a human king, a real ruler of ancient Salem, possibly early Jerusalem, a monotheistic priest living in a world dominated by pagan nations, perhaps a righteous man, a wise king, an ancient priest who eventually became part of biblical history. But for many scholars, that explanation never seemed sufficient, because there is something about Melchizedek that appears to escape the normal rules of the biblical narrative itself. And then another interpretation emerged, one of the most accepted views within Christianity: the idea that Melchizedek was a prophetic reflection of Christ, a symbolic figure pointing towards something much greater yet to come, because several elements directly connect the two: the eternal priesthood, the bread and wine, spiritual authority above Abraham, and most importantly, the phrase that echoed across centuries: "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." That was when many began to see Melchizedek not merely as a man, but as a symbol of Christ himself. But some theories go even further, much further. There is an ancient interpretation known as Christophany, the idea that certain mysterious figures in the Old Testament were temporary manifestations of Christ before the Incarnation. And according to some scholars, Melchizedek may have been exactly that. not merely a symbol, but Christ himself appearing before Abraham thousands of years before Bethlehem. At first, that may sound impossible. But supporters of this theory point to highly unusual details. Without beginning of days, without end of life, without genealogy. Descriptions that seem to transcend ordinary human existence completely.
But the mystery continues to grow, because other ancient interpretations claim something even more unsettling. That Melchizedek was not an ordinary man, but a celestial being. Some ancient Jewish writings suggest he possessed a direct connection to the heavens, as if he occupied a spiritual position above mankind itself. And this opened the door to centuries of speculation. Was he an angel, a divine messenger, an ancient spiritual guardian, perhaps a figure connected to the heavenly mysteries described in ancient texts? And the fewer answers exist, the greater the mystery becomes. But there is another theory even more fascinating. The idea that Melchizedek belonged to a primordial order, an ancient priesthood existing even before the formation of Israel. That changes the entire perspective of the biblical narrative, because it would mean that before Moses, before the law, before the temple, there already existed a priesthood directly connected to God Most High. And Melchizedek would have been one of the guardians of that ancient spiritual order. Perhaps that is exactly why his figure feels so disconnected from the rest of human history, as if he belonged to something far older, something that existed before the kingdoms of the earth themselves. But then another question emerges. If Melchizedek truly existed, who taught him? Where did his knowledge come from? How did he know the Most High God before the nation of Israel even existed? Perhaps we will never fully discover the answer, but there is another deeply symbolic detail. Salem, the kingdom ruled by Melchizedek. Many scholars believe Salem was ancient Jerusalem. If that is true, then Melchizedek ruled the very place that would later become the spiritual center of biblical history. That makes everything even more astonishing, because it means that long before Israel existed as a nation, long before the temple, there was already a mysterious figure in that land directly connected to the eternal priesthood. And perhaps that is exactly what makes Melchizedek so fascinating. He seems to exist outside the normal rules of the Bible itself, appearing without beginning, disappearing without end, and continuing to echo across centuries surrounded by mystery. But perhaps the most unsettling theory of all is connected to the end times, because some apocryphal texts and ancient Jewish writings suggest something profoundly mysterious. The possibility that Melchizedek is not merely a figure of the past, but someone directly connected to the final events of humanity. In certain ancient interpretations, Melchizedek appears associated with judgment, with redemption, with the heavenly priesthood, as if his story has not yet completely ended. And that raises a disturbing possibility. If Melchizedek truly possesses a connection to the eternal priesthood, could his presence appear again in Revelation? Some scholars believe not, that all of this is merely symbolic, a spiritual representation used by the scriptures. But others see something far greater hidden between the lines of the ancient texts. Because if Melchizedek transcends genealogy, time, and even recorded death itself, then perhaps his existence is connected to something beyond ordinary human understanding. And then an even deeper question emerges. If the events of Revelation truly draw near, what role would a figure like Melchizedek play? Would he return announcing the coming of Christ? Would he appear as a heavenly priest before humanity? Or does his connection to the end times conceal something even more mysterious? Perhaps a warning, perhaps judgment, perhaps redemption. And some darker interpretations go even further. They claim that before humanity's final collapse, ancient spiritual figures would rise once again in the world, not as ordinary kings, but as living symbols of something far greater unfolding behind human history itself. Perhaps all of this is only interpretation, perhaps symbolism, or perhaps there is something about Melchizedek that ancient civilizations once understood, but the modern world gradually forgot. Because the more his figure is studied, the less he seems to belong solely to the past, and the more his presence appears to echo silently across the centuries, as if his true story has not yet been fully revealed. Perhaps Melchizedek was merely a man, perhaps a forgotten king, perhaps an ancient priest, perhaps a celestial being, or perhaps something far greater than we imagine. And while the world continues trying to decipher the mysteries of the scriptures, his name remains alive, silent, eternal. Like a shadow moving through the centuries of human history, some mysteries were never meant to be forgotten. Ancient civilizations, forbidden scriptures, lost worlds buried beneath history itself. What if the Bible contains secrets humanity still cannot fully explain? Welcome to Echoes of Revelation. Explore the unknown.